Hello and welcome back. Today we are continuing our Victoria 3 tutorial series, this time doing a tutorial that was highly requested, which was talking about the new military systems in patch 1.5. This is going to principally include the new formations, which allows you to choose between infantry, artillery, and cavalry, and create different compositions. We will be talking about mobilization options. This UI will be getting a facelift next week, and so expect it to look different, but we'll still talk about it, as well as being able to push in multiple states at once, multiple battles on a front, which is a very substantive change in 1.5. There will likely be chapters at the very bottom, so you can navigate to different concepts you want, and there will likely be a summary at the end if you just kind of wanted the fast and short version of it. And without further ado, let's jump into the basic explanation of these things. So previously, all the interaction you used to happen at the site of the building. This is no longer the case. Now the building only determines the training methodology, which is going to determine how quickly the troops can get recruited up, and also affect experience, which is a new change. Coming in, you can see all the interaction is now going to happen at the site of the army itself and not the buildings. And you can create new armies, and armies are not automatically created by creating buildings. If we kind of hover, we can take a look at how the experience affects things. This veteran is going to have more experience, and you notice they are going to have a more offense and more defense than this raw recruit. 31 versus 36 on offense, 51 versus 58, both for trench infantry here. And so veterancy is going to be a new mechanic that is introduced. So perhaps the meat and potatoes is the new formation mechanic, which is going to allow you to choose between 3 unit types: infantry, artillery, and cavalry. Notably, you have to have at least 50% infantry in an army, otherwise you suffer a malus. If we hover the new organization mechanic and we hover organization, we can see here the penalty we will suffer as we lose organization. In particular, we will have a penalty that is incurred that will trend us towards this absolute floor, which will give us minus 25% offense, minus 10% defense, minus 100% morale recovery. Notably, there are other ways to get morale recovery, so this doesn't mean your morale won't recover at all, and minus 50% recovery rate. It is not worth suffering this, and we will explain why in the strategy section. So just know that you will want to have at least 50% of your army be infantry. Infantry, bread and butter, they are going to specialize in defense, and they are going to, for the most part, have worse stats than artillery, which we will get to in a moment, until the very, very late game PM. But they will be, a majority of your army will be comprised of trench or of infantry in general. Coming over artillery, generally speaking, and this artillery PM is a little bit behind trench. Artillery in general will have higher stats throughout most of the game until you get to NCO infantry. They will give you a lot more offense and also critically kill rate, which is going to be relevant in some situations when you do not have enough units to fully cover fronts. Kill rates will become more important, but you can think of these as your better offensive units and your best stats overall up until NCO training, at which case it tends to even out between infantry and artillery. And finally, we have cavalry. Now if you start off with very, very bad irregulars or something like this, cavalry stats are actually decent, but they will tend to be relatively poor. But what you get from cavalry is instead battle occupation, as well as access to certain maneuvers, which we will discuss in a moment. And so cavalry is going to generally not be that good, but I think that they have a little bit of a niche in terms of landing forces. Notably, all the cavalry PMs are unlocked with the very first military PM, and they do look a little bit different, and different ones are unlocked based on certain laws, but for the most part, I believe Lancers is overall the best, and the main attraction is this battle occupation stat. And so that's kind of just a quick and dirty. We will get into it a little bit more. There are also now a ton of mobilization options that happen at different sites. You can see that there's going to be a lot of new things. We have offense, defense, a bunch of stuff that gives morale. We will talk about these more, morale recovery, but these are going to be part of a strategic decision, and you can mix and match them based on your army. And so this is why everything happening at the side of the army is so important, because we might want to have like a zippy fast, type of mobilization option where we're paying a lot for transportation on some army, and then some armies where we're just parking them at home, and notably see this all infantry except for these cavalry. We might want to have a strategy for these guys that is going to be less dependent on, utilizing any sort of transportation. And so you can mix and match and tweak stuff according to specific strategies you have for units. And so bifurcating units, or more than bifurcating, based on what you want their role to fill, is going to be something that will take place. And finally, a very, very substantive change is now that now multiple battles can happen per front, and this is going to be decided, you can have up to as many battles, you can start up to as many battles as you have generals, and so you will want to assign or have lots of generals in your armies as part of your strategy. And coming in here, there will be different orders as well. You notice here is not just advance and defend front, there's a wide array of new orders that are going to be generally better than generic advance or defense, but are going to have different types of trade-offs and sometimes different requirements. So for example, rapid advance requires that we have at least 30% of the army be cavalry, and so this will inform to some extent what your strategies are, how you're going to do things, and this is just kind of the very quick and dirty explanation of the new mechanics here. So the most common question that gets asked is, what is the ratio that is going to be optimal for infantry, artillery, and cavalry? The very short answer is, if you go half infantry and half artillery, you're not going to be making a huge mistake at any point. And so this is kind of the simplest answer, but there's a little bit more nuanced one, and the answer is going to be whatever maximizes the amount of offense you have while attacking and defense you have while defending will have a sensitivity for certain situations where you might want to forego this for, other advantages that you might be able to get. In order to unpack this, we're going to need to talk about two things. In particular, one is there are asymmetrical situations where you can guarantee you will always be attacking, or you can guarantee you will always be defending. So that's thing one. But two, we are going to need to talk about how troop borrowing works right now, and how troop borrowing is going to work in a week, and also how troop borrowing probably should work and doesn't really work like this. And so let's jump into that. So we have Dev Diary number 101, to clear things up. The way it used to work is you used to be able to borrow on offense and defense. You would borrow troops. And now you can only borrow on defense currently, but they are going to be instituting a new change which will allow you to also borrow troops on offense as well. But there's a catch. So the catch here is that when you borrow troops, both on offense and defense, in terms of the game mechanics, you actually will borrow indiscriminately of whatever your formations ratio is, which I think is bad. But the way it currently works is you will borrow artillery if you're on offense. You will borrow the best unit you can for the job, which is often artillery on offense. And then you will borrow the best unit for the job on defense, which tends to be trench infantry. And so what you will get if you have a sufficiently large army on a front, such that your entire army cannot occupy the combat width, is you will get a situation where you are going to have all artillery on attack and all infantry on defense, which of course is great for you, but it means if you had set up a particular ratio, the ratio is not going to be what's achieved in battle. We have a half and half army. When we push, if we have a bunch of these half and half armies, which is kind of what we've organized, if we have a sufficiently large amount and we're pushing on a narrow front, we will get all offense while on offense. We will get all artillery on offense. And similarly, we will get all infantry on defense. And so what this does is this makes it so you absolutely never want to, experience this penalty, because if we go over and suffer the organization penalty, which is going to give us minus offense and defense, this will apply when we are borrowing troops. And so we don't ever want to suffer this. So this is rule principle 1. But the second principle is going to be for the live version right now before 1.5.10, you are going to want to have really, really big offensive armies, because you can't borrow on offense right now. And because you cannot borrow on offense, you are going to want to make sure your pushing armies are sufficiently large to be able to accomplish your goals. In patch 1.5.10, having our offensive army in particular be large will not be as important, and two armies of the same size will be just fine. We could split this up into 20 and 20 and 20 and 20 rather than 40 and 40, but without troop borrowing, we will not want to do this. Instead, we will want to have really big stacks, because this will be better, especially if the fronts get really gummed up with both sides having multiple armies on the front, because we'll push in with something like an 80 stack in this case, and then they'll defend with with 120 stack if the infrastructure is sufficiently large to allow for the combat width, and this will be kind of a little bit of a bad time for us. But let's talk about, our army ratios a little bit as a result of kind of how we're thinking about things. This is our pushing army. These purple guys here, you can notably change this stuff here. This is our pushing army. We have half and half. This maximizes the amount of artillery we can bring to bear, which have the best offensive stats, and we unfortunately have to go with the infantry because we know troops will be borrowed. We don't want to suffer any of the mobilization penalty unless we absolutely have to, the organization penalty, and so we are not going to overrun an additional amount of artillery because we want to suffer this penalty as little as possible. So this is kind of the first thing on our offensive army. Now there's 3 contexts where you will be able to guarantee you are always attacking and always defending, and we have specific armies for these 3 contexts. The first is very straightforward. This is our defensive army, and we just have infantry in it. Notably, this army is way smaller on live because we can borrow on defense, and we in particular will get to put in generals. We'll come back to this later, and have them only defend. If your generals are on only defend, you can guarantee you will not be attacking. And so it makes a lot of sense to have, I think, an all defensive army and a pushing army on the same front together. And also you can look to plug holes with defensive armies, especially a ton of little small ones, and maybe not push every front and just to defend on a front. Overall, defense has an advantage relative to offense, in Victoria 3 if the armies are not being able to bring 100% artillery to bear, because they will be up to half arty, half infantry. The AI doesn't really build a lot of artillery, and so when they're pushing in, with their 30 offense into the 40 defense, you will grind them up. And so I do think it's worthwhile to have all defensive armies alongside all offensive armies. The other situation that you will guarantee you are always defending is going to be very similar, and that is going to be when you are defending against landings, we have a separate group for this. Just because the mobilization option, we won't need any transportation on this, which is a little bit different than we might want transportation on our defensive armies, so this is why we have a different composition. But these will be all defense as well, they will be all infantry, 100% infantry as well for defending, because we are trying to maximize for defense here. We could put in artillery for like kill rate, but this isn't going to be worth lowering the defense, and we could put this in for battle occupation and kill rate, but again, there's not much point. And so I think that having a defending against armies. And the third army we have, the third composition where you are guaranteeing you are always attacking, is when you are landing someone else. And this is the situation where I think cavalry is usable. One of the reasons cavalry overall suffers in terms of stats is because they have really bad defense, and notably when you are landing, that unit's on its own. There's no borrowing happening. However, cavalry have decent offense. 30 offense is decent for most of the game. You can see our shrapnel artillery does have 45. It is quite a bit higher. But if we come in, we take a look, you were going to unlock Lancers with the very first tech. And if we take a look at some of the earlier artilleries, like cannon artillery, it might have better overall. This one doesn't even have better overall stats. It's going to have 15 or 25 offense instead of 30. If we get something like Napoleonic getting mobile artillery, 35 offense, the cavalry is not terrible, but instead what you can get with cavalry, and we will talk about this more later, is you are getting battle occupation. And so with landing forces specifically, I think you either want to land with, these huge stacks that are artillery, and if you're expecting any sort of resistance, artillery and infantry together with landings is going to be what you want to land with. However, if you're not expecting resistance, little small armies that utilize cavalry in order to get a higher battle occupation rate, I think will be worthwhile. And I think this is where you sacrifice stats in exchange for, you're sacrificing the better stats of artillery so that you can get the battle occupation rate and also gain access, to order stuff, which I think we will maybe talk about now. So for each general, you will now have a choice between a whole bunch of orders that you can give in terms of how they advance and how they defend. We're going to highlight a few, starting off with rapid advance, which of course is going to be good for our landing armies because it is going to give more general advancement speed so they can push their fronts faster, and also battle occupation. Very often, if you have, these guys that are very heavy on the Lancers, by the way, you might even want to go over 50% 50%. This is not what we're doing currently because you will really suffer pretty significant penalties, but if you're just looking to zip in when they leave it unawares, you're going to get 30% occupation here. It's going to be halved because it's half the unit, so 15% plus extra push speed, and very often you can get to a situation where you are pushing the front faster than the enemy army can get to the front if you have a whole variety of, good transportation, good reconnaissance, because we don't have any available yet, this type of stuff that allows you to get more occupation and travel speed, and you just really occupy while they can't do anything. And so rapid advance in particular is really good on landing squads, but it's also reasonable if you compare it just to regular advanced front, is probably a little bit better. And we'll come back to a trick you can do. You're taking more casualties, but you're getting more advancement speed, and you're getting more morale damage, and you're also getting more battle occupation. And so overall, it does seem to be a little bit better than just generic advanced front. Overall, all the special orders seem a little bit better. And rapid advance is only going to require that you have an army that is at least 30% cav. Unfortunately, cav not that good on the stats. We'll come back to this. Last stand gives you the absolute most defense. I think it is preferable, in particular on the cases of, your armies that are going to be defending against landings. You get a lot of extra casualties taken. Notably, casualties taken is going to negatively affect experience gain, I think, a little bit, and is maybe a bit of a concern, but I think that for the extra defense, it's maybe worth it, and they have to have certain traits. This is going to be one of the more common themes. You have to have Stalwart Defender, Trench Rat, or Defense in Depth Specialist. The next one is Heavy Advance, which I believe is the only one that gives over 10% offense. It gives 15% offense. It is going to require tanks, so it's a little bit of a late game, but I just wanted to note it. Adamant Defense is going to be very easy to achieve, and it also gives 15% defense instead of 20%, extra supply consumption, and more dug-in chance. Dug-in is, of course, going to be a pretty good roll, and so this might be a little bit better than Last Stand in general on your defensive armies, and we are going to require us to have defensive strategist, experienced defensive strategist, and expert defensive strategist, these sorts of things. Notably, you're more likely to get these traits, I believe, winning battles on your specific offense and defense, which is all the more reason to have dedicated people for offense and defense. Finally, we have delaying tactics, which is going to require that we are 80% infantry in particular, and it has to have one of pillager, cruel, wrathful, or bandit. And what this will do is it'll give defense, it'll give extra morale loss, but camouflage chance, extra army defense, and surprise maneuver chance. These are both very, very solid, and so we will be able to get this. I'm not sure if it's better than adamant defense. This is a little bit, I think it's maybe a little bit worse, but it's going to be fairly solid. But for this one, notably, you have to have over 80% defense. Well, we have that, 80% infantry. We definitely have that with our all-defensive army, these 100% defensive armies. And so suddenly we are going to be able to use orders on this army while borrowing troops from this army. We can borrow the trench infantry from this army and then use an order on this army when we are borrowing troops. And you begin to see where some of the exploitation comes in because of the borrowing mechanic. We can effectively use troops that really shouldn't be able to use the 80% infantry thing because they only are half and half by borrowing troops. And so we will be able to get more last stands on our defensive armies. Now, I don't know which of these guys has, not last stands, delaying tactics, but coming back, what about rapid advance, which seems quite a bit better and only requires you have cav? What I think the metagame is going to be when you are allowed to borrow units on offense is something that is quite gamey. I'm not sure exactly if I'm going to do it, but it's going to be having armies that have one cavalry, and these guys will just carry your generals, and you will just set them all to rapid advance, because the only requirement for rapid advance is that you have more cavalry, or you have at least 30% cavalry. One lancer is 30% cavalry, and we don't care that our stats are getting wrecked by this, mobilization modifier, this modifier that is, or the organization modifier. We don't care that we're getting wrecked by this, because almost all of our troops will be borrowed from the pushing armies, which don't have this penalty on any of the battalions, and so we will be just fine. Now, if you have multiple generals, it might be the case that you're going to need at least 3 lancers, to use 3 generals, but this is going to be kind of like a quick overview of orders. Not 100% which ones are best. Really do think rapid advance is strong. Really think this is going to kind of be the strategy where you are now in 1.5.10 going to want a pushing army that carries the troops, a defensive army, all defensive, and then a general carrying army where all the actual pushers are set to rapid advance, and they will borrow from the pushing army, which will have no pushing generals, because you would rather run rapid advance. And so, reckless advance, it gives you a little bit more offense, but I think this blunder chance is a little bit annoying, so an aggressive maneuver is not necessarily... I think the rapid advance overall is going to be a little bit better, and so it's a bit of an interesting situation there. So also important for orders is the multiple fronts business. You will want to have as many generals as you have states adjacent. So here we have a war with Russia. And so if we want to push as much as possible, which might not necessarily be the case because we might not actually have enough cannons to, relative to the combat width, to really have all cannons pushing, and we don't really want to push with the infantry, and so you might want to tone down, the number of pushers, but we're definitely going to want to have one defender for each state that is exposed on the front, because you can have one battle per state. So we see Ili, we would want at least one general here, one general for this, one general for this, one general for this, or let's actually count because our brain. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we would want at least 7 generals, which isn't too hard because I think we will probably have maybe 3 of these pushing armies, which we have a mix of, pushers and defenders. I think this army's up here, and then we will just need a couple of these. So we will have the defense covered, and then we will be able to push into a number of provinces equal to the number of pushing generals we have. And so the more generals we assign, assuming we don't have an absolute glut of troops, the fewer troops are actually going to get brought in on the attack. And so this does create a little bit of an interesting situation where I think you're going to want fewer attackers unless you have an overwhelming advantage, and then you're going to want a ton of attackers. And so I think that the principle now, without doing this cheesiness with the one cavalry pushing armies, what I think the strategy will be is you will want to run 1 to 3 on offense and defense with your general pushing army, and then you will want to cover as many defensive, guys as possible on your defending armies. This way you will guarantee, stalwart defender, shout out to you, last stand. This way you will always be able to guarantee that you have a general on defense. If they push into you and you don't have a general, that's going to be really bad for your overall stats. And notably, this is also going to increase the chances that we are running extra defense, maximizing our stats when we have a general, because we will have a defending general ready to catch them. If the general's on defense or they have better stats for defense, they're more likely to get selected. They're also more likely to get selected if their units have more morale. And so if we just pushed and we lost a bunch of morale with our pushing army, then our defensive army is more likely to get selected on defense, which is of course exactly what we want. If our army that's on defense can't defend, and so this is going to be kind of how we are going to maximize, make sure we have enough defenders. The defenders are more likely to roll into battle, and also the offense guys will not be stuck in without having a defensive order, and instead will be able to benefit from having an offensive order. Obviously, all of the guys who are on offense will have offensive orders, so this is just going to be how it works. This is an important consideration now with the multiple battles on the fronts regarding orders. Also, quick note on our landing armies, we do have 4 offensive generals always. The main idea is if we, manage to breach a front, we want to be able to push in 4 states simultaneously and cover as much ground as possible, with all of them, of course, on rapid advance, and just really looking to sneak in there more than anything. If we are landing into what we know is a huge army, we don't actually use these landing squads. We instead use, our regular pushing armies. Finally, we need to talk about mobilization options. Notably, after 1.5.10, they should look a little bit more like this. They are improving the UI. And so if it doesn't look like how we have it on our demo, don't be alarmed. It's still the same thing, but coming back into it, we are going to have tons of options, and we're just going to I'm going to give my impressions on these options at this point in time. Overall, I think you just kind of want to use all the options you can as a general heuristic, but we'll break it down a little bit more. I think that creating demand for groceries countries, economically speaking, is decent shout, and morale loss modifiers, getting rid of these is going to be nice. Notably, when we come in on, having to pay this organization penalty, in theory, if you had to borrow armies proportionate to your kind of army that you have going on, there would be maybe niche cases where you would want to go over 50% artillery, something like this, and then you would be making up for the morale recovery that you are losing by instead gaining some from stuff like supplies. Luxurious supplies is just seems to be crazy good, giving 5% offense and defense. For supplements, I think you kind of want to use what you generally have access to, but you notice something. We're not using tobacco. Tobacco is generally an inferior good. The PM is not as efficient as opium, and it is also not as good as liquor, and these are substitutes for each other, and so we would prefer to actually not stimulate the tobacco in our economy, and so only on the armies we absolutely care the most about their morale recovery are we going to want to use tobacco specifically. And so this is going to be kind of how we think about this one, and just a bit interesting maybe. Also, obviously, if you don't have opium, don't use it, this sort of thing. Transportation, I think, is interesting. Forced march might be a little free, and you might just want to use it. It doesn't cost anything, and it just gives you this morale loss penalty. You can make up for it with these other supplies and such, but is going to give you more mobilization speed and also critically formation travel speed. This might be especially important in the multiplayer metagame. We're not currently using it because we haven't found it to feel quite necessary, but maybe we would be able to make more breakaway runs if we push through, especially if we're using the rapid advance cheese, and so if we are using the rapid advanced cheese, forced march is probably going to be something you want to use. For rail transport, this is something that we are using on all of our landing armies, and is the only landing thing we are using it on. They get railway mobilization speed, which is great for, zipping around, friendly territory, but also formation travel speed. If we can get breakaway kind of situations where our formation is pushing faster than they can get to the front, so they try and get to the front and then the front moves. They try and get to the front, then the front moves. This situation can be created if you have a lot of these kind of modifiers, and so rail transport is an interesting one. Truck transport is a little bit faster, but automobiles are kind of a bad PM. And after 1.5, currently in 1.5.9, if you run a shortage, it doesn't do anything negative other than you have to pay a lot for goods. But once you have to start running this negative, then maybe you don't use truck transport just because automobiles, bad PM. Coming in, even though automobiles get expensive and it says it's profitable, it's still bad. We're not going to go into it now because that's outside the scope of this video, but it's bad. So we have motorized reconnaissance. And this, this and aerial reconnaissance might be worth doing, again, trying to get those breakaway situations with extra battle occupation here, you can see, and also, rapid advance, these types of things, allowing you to push quite a bit faster, ideally, and this might create a situation once we get on these, especially in a multiplayer metagame, where you want to have catcher armies, defensive armies to just catch breakaways, if this is going to be a bit of a thing, and you just kind of set one of these, maybe with 10 units, on defense in, to defend against landings, and then also when landings come in to take control of the front quite quickly, and so you just have these fast defensive formations. This might be something worth doing, but it is something to consider with reconnaissance. But I think for the most part you are going to want to always use these on the landing army, and maybe also use them on the pushing army, but I think that if I'm not mistaken, this applies not to the troops themselves but to the general. And so it might be the case that you don't actually want to use this on the pushing army we have, but instead on the one stack that is going to be borrowing the troops, because if all the mobilizations are applying not to the troops themselves, but instead to the general, especially with the surprise, definitely the maneuver chance and loss chance, these are going to be really useful. But if the occupation and other such is based on these guys, based on the general, it's tied to the general rather than the troops, which I think it's going to be tied to the general. It's actually just going to be obscene, and you will not use too many PMs on this guy. I'm not 100% sure how this is going to work though, but just something to mention. Let's kind of keep going into them. Support equipment. I think you are generally going to want to use, for your offensive armies, you're generally going to want to use all the offensive stuff, and this one is going to be very critical whether it applies to the units or to the general, and so this will require a little bit more investigation once your troop borrowing is working correctly on offense, but on defense you will want machine gunners on everyone, and you will probably not want machine gunners on the pushing guys. Well, maybe it's worth it. Ammunition's really inefficient as a good. Small arms is very efficient, though, so maybe you don't care that much. Oil is pretty expensive. Fertilizer's fine, and so maybe you want to use chemo weapons, but not fertilizer, something like this. For reconnaissance, oil is very expensive. Automobiles is not a very good industry. Planes aren't that great either. And then I think on medical support, you generally are going to want to use it, and notably, this can help offset some of the things that give negative recovery rate, and also notably, recovery rate effectively undoes your opponent's kill rate. Obviously, you can't do this if you don't have opium, but these are going to be kind of how I like to think about these. They're not going to necessarily be tailored too much towards companies. I think for supplies and supplements, you just kind of turn them all on for everyone, as well as medical support. And then we again did have the transportation and reconnaissance considerations in regard to speed. I think they're going to add more of these mobilization stuff moving forward, and that will be quite interesting. And so this will hopefully give a little bit more bifurcation in regards to what's going to be done. If someone knows for certain exactly if these apply to the unit, if they apply to the general or to the units within the unit, please let me know, because that would be fantastic, and I will pin the comment, because this is kind of an important thing, as it will greatly affect the metagame. But that is kind of just a quick rundown on mobilization options, what we think of them, and different situations that might occur. So to summarize, there are three really big changes. The first is the different formations. Infantry is going to be good on defense, artillery is going to be good on offense, and overall going to have the best stats until the late game. Cavalry stats aren't going to be good, but you get battle occupation. They are going to fulfill different roles, but I think roughly speaking, the strategy we've come up with is we have a pushing army, which is going to be quite large, relatively speaking. It is going to be comprised half infantry, half artillery. This is to avoid the organization malice, which has been introduced. Otherwise, you would go 100% artillery, and then it just maximizes artillery. What you care about is maximizing stats, and then we are going to have defending armies, and then these are going to be all infantry, maximizing defense, and we're going to have landing armies. These can lean on cavalry. 100% cavalry is maybe reasonable, but you will suffer the malice. But the idea is these guys are going to be trying to get into weak defense and then occupy territory as quickly as possible, and so I think that these are kind of how you want to think about these different things. Also, what's been introduced in 1.5 is battles on multiple fronts. Or multiple battles. These battles are limited by the number of states adjacent in each battle line, and so in the case of China versus Russia, there's a particularly long battle line where there's 7-ish opportunities for battles, and so you will want to make sure you have at least one general for both on defense for each kind of adjacent state, and then potentially on offense. However, you will have smaller armies pushing if you have a bunch of offense guys, and so this is maybe not the case, whereas the defensive guys will just catch whatever's pushing and you just have to catch it. And so is maybe going to be the case that you want to, in particular, if you don't have a really big numerical advantage, have fewer pushers and look to go a little bit slower, or even go on all defense, this type of thing. Part of the big strategy is going to be maximizing offense and defense. To that extent, you do want to utilize the new mechanics and try and make sure you have at least one person defending on the front, because these are going to give extra defense, and then you can choose which of these orders is going to be kind of best. We did talk about a strategy that's going to be possible in 1.5.10, where you can get everything having rapid advance on offense, which seems particularly strong, by having an army that has one cavalry and just has a bunch of generals, because you can borrow troops. Currently, the way troops borrowing works is it tends to borrow the very best units. So this is very critical, because it will lead to situations where you're using like all of your artillery but suffering no penalty. You will not suffer the org penalty when you are borrowing. Currently, you can only borrow on defense. You can't borrow on offense. So currently in 1.5.9, you want really big armies. armies for pushing because they cannot borrow any allies for pushing. However, after 1.5.10, you will be able to turn off setting on or off for this, and you will be able to borrow on offense, and this is when this kind of strategy will go live. I think that the way it should work is not the way it works, which is that you should have to borrow the exact proportion of the commander in there, and so this is how you can get rapid advance without having to use the cavalry, by having a one stack and then having a bunch of guys with them. You might need an amount of units equal to these guys, the number of generals you have, but this is kind of a little bit of a consideration. There's also new mobilization options. I think in general you will want to turn them all on, and then in particular for landing squads of various kinds, I think you will want to use the maneuverability ones. They aren't necessarily super necessarily. Engines input is kind of a dirty input. You don't really want to create buy orders for engines in your market, and so is oil, because oil is really efficient. Automobiles are terrible. As a PM, we're not going to explain why. And so in general, the transportation and reconnaissance, I think you are going to want to use for fast armies specifically, of which we kind of mentioned two kinds, landing, and also maybe having a fast defensive army that can look to catch opponents' landings without too much pain, and notably will not lose them if they start pushing really, really fast. This is probably more important in the context of multiplayer, but overall, other than that, I think it's the case that you just want to use as much equipment as possible, except on your defensive armies. Obviously, you don't use the plus offense PMs, and on your offensive armies you probably don't use machine guns, but maybe you do. Yeah, you probably use machine guns. And so this is kind of the considerations regarding the battle options and this sort of stuff. There's also experience in game. I think experience makes maybe you really care a lot more about recovery rate as a result of experience. It does give you a little bit of a stat boost, but overall it doesn't seem extremely robust. Now everything happens at the site of the armies itself. You can create new armies and then fiddle with them. You have the zero stack, you recruit, you add armies, this type of thing. We notably didn't really talk about conscription. You can add conscripts and then click the raise conscript button that will appear. So if we add conscripts here and then we raise the army, which we don't have raised currently, we would be able to raise the conscript. And so this is how conscripts work, just kind of very briefly, but this is going to be, everything happens at the site of this, with the exception of the training method, which will determine training rate, and I think it also gives experience. And so these will happen in the buildings now, but everything has been moved from the buildings to the army, and this is kind of the user interface we've been playing with. I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube algorithm thing, and other than that, happy hunting and have a good military time.